everyone. We are here for another Thursday Think and Link. And for those of you joining us, this is an event we put on, now once a month. It used to be twice a month. Now it's going to be once a month. And we bring in some amazing thinkers to have a conversation, a casual conversation about any number of subjects. At a minimum, though, we talk about design. It is something that we do to give back to our community, to our global community, for those seeking opportunities, friendships, professions, because we are a curious crew here at Capsule. We are always seeking to learn from others and from our network of thinkers and doers. So we've had some amazing guests, and we have two absolutely amazing guests on the stage today. We have Katherine and Stephen, and they are steeped in retail and are going to give us a really amazing perspective, which is very timely considering we're coming off of the National Retail Federation events, and all conversations around retail are an extremely hot topic, of course. And so I am going to, and my co-host, Kelly Leighton, and myself, we'll be asking these questions as we go along and quizzing them on their perspective and background, and of course, Stephen's book, Remarkable Retail. But before I do that, I want to make sure that each of you have a chance to do your own introductions, and then Kelly's going to ask you the first question on our list. So Katherine, take it away.
Sure. So first of all, thanks for having me, and it's a privilege to be talking shop with one of the most influential retail, influencers, Steve. So thank you in advance. So again, my name is Katherine, and I am President of Commerce for North America at Stanley Black Decker, which means that I control the e-business P&L, and I direct end-to-end strategy and transformation. Prior to SBD, I held P&L roles at both kind of early stage and larger organizations, all at the intersection of marketing and technology and digital. I'm very passionate about all things retail.
Great. Wonderful. Steve.
Well, thanks for having me as well. It's great. Excuse me. It's great to be here with Katherine. So I've been in retail a really long time. I did a few things earlier in my career, but really since the early 90s, I've been exclusively in retail. First two-thirds of that, I would say, was on the management side. So I worked at Sears many years ago in a variety of roles. Then I moved down to Dallas, where I am now, to join the Neiman Marcus Group as the head of strategy. And when I was at Neiman Marcus, I also picked up responsibility for customer insight, loyalty programs, those sort of things. And then for, I guess it's about a dozen years now, I've been off on my own doing strategy consulting, speaking, writing, launched the Remarkable Retail podcast a few years ago. So I guess I'm kind of a retail renaissance man. Probably the best way to say that.
Love that. A great description. Wonderful. Well, Katherine and Steve, we're so glad to have you here. And as Aaron mentioned, very timely. We just attended the National Retail Federation conference in New York City, heard a lot of conversation around retail, physical retail. It's not dead, Steve, as I'll quote you. It just needs to be more exciting, for sure. So we're going to certainly talk a lot about retail and what it means to you and both of you in your roles, the book that you've written, Steve. So I'd like to start with just a foundational question. Sounds simple, but I would guess you both have your own definitions of retail. What does retail mean to you? I'm curious if you could define, give your perspectives, and that'll set the stage for some future questions. So Katherine, let's start with you.
Great.
Your definition.
Yeah. So I, personally have a very, very broad definition of retail. So it's not limited to the stores that kind of quickly come to mind. As we know, the lines are blurring between industries, between functions. We see like retailers, starting brands and selling services. We see like restaurants selling merchandise. Social networks now have commerce capabilities. So, at SBD specifically, we have brands like Black Decker that are on drop ship. So just a little bit of a flavor of the the blurring of boundaries. And so like what really is a manufacturer, what is a retailer, is increasingly not so black and white. And I think it's it's all about the consumer. And if you notice in my title, it's commerce for a reason.
That's right. The blurring of functions. When you mentioned that's interesting. That's great perspective, Katherine. Thank you. Helpful to hear. Steve, let's hear your take.
I don't know that I have that much more to offer. I mean, I think at the basic level, it's the selling of products and services to consumers. It's just that if you go back, that used to be much more straightforward. For the most part, you had wholesale retail, you didn't have e-commerce. So now, to Catherine's point, I think it's just become very blended and blurred and much more expansive. You've got makers of things selling things through Etsy, which really wasn't possible on any scale. So I think it's just really expanded and gotten more complicated.
Absolutely.
That's great. Yeah.
Aaron, I know you've got some questions on the tail end
Yeah.
of that. Listen.
Yeah, Steve, I've thoroughly enjoyed your book, and I know many have. And
Is this subtle, by the way? Is this subtle enough?
It's not subtle enough. No. That's great. That's great. I love it. Well done. Yeah, it is. And it's just gotten a wonderful endorsement from Joe Pine, one of my other most favorite authors in the world. And it was absolutely beautiful. So I'm curious, and you were really straightforward and elegant, really, about your perspective on Sears and your one of your origin points in retail, because everybody looks at that case study in history and maybe be critical of it in some cases, and really shouldn't be, because there's a lot to learn from that and learn from what happened there. But I'm curious. Just give me your personal journey and how you got into retail, and then what you've seen as the evolution that's happened in the past 2 decades, really, I guess would be the best way to look at it, because it's had the biggest revolution, I think, in the last 2 decades.
Yeah, well, a little bit of an accidental retailer. I was looking to get out of a job I had. I was living in Chicago at the time, and I was really trying to find a company where I could get into more of a general management role, because I've been really emphasizing finance and strategy. And I definitely knew I wanted something more consumer oriented, but I was not looking for retail in particular. And I just happened to be approached by a search firm for an opportunity at Sears for what was essentially an internal consulting group. So I could kind of leverage my strategy, finance backgrounds. But the promise was, if you came into that group, you would get moved into a general management role. And that ended up being what happened. And then I guess at a certain point, I either didn't know how to do anything else, or I got the bug and just kept moving up the ladder and across a lot of different categories. In terms of what I've seen, the 1990s, and I don't want to make this too much of a history lesson, but back in the 90s, even though we were seeing Walmart expand like crazy, and really the emergence of the category killers like Best Buy, Home Depot, et cetera, malls were still pretty much a big thing at that time. And this idea of having a place where you could go see a little bit of everything was still a pretty powerful idea. And so in some ways, malls were incredibly convenient. But then slowly, as we all know by now, I mean, even before e-commerce, you just had more and more category killers. You had more general merchandise players off the mall. Walmart's expansion, Target's expansion, Kohl's. And what made malls powerful, and what made Sears in particular powerful, those advantages really started to erode. And then obviously e-commerce and all sorts of other things started to happen. So, retail's always been dynamic. I think the thing that's been most, impactful to me has been just how much the pace keeps accelerating. And I don't think most retailers really appreciate that kind of exponential progression versus a more linear progression.
Yeah. That's the part that's really continues to be fascinating, because you wouldn't think that it could hit that exponential curve as far as change, but it is definitely happening all the way. There's moments when you think, well, maybe we've stabilized at a point in retail where it's understood and this is where we are, but then you turn around and it's not. You go to National Retail Federation and you see all these robots tooling around, and there was a I've been telling this story to so many people, and I don't know that we need this thing, but it was basically a convenience cart in the form of, or a vending machine in the form of a minivan that you order up on your app on your phone, wherever you are, and it shows up. So like in the city of New York, you want a candy bar, you order up a candy bar and it shows up in front of you in the form of a minivan. Talk about convenient retail, but I don't know that we need that much convenience. That might be a bit much. I mean, let's take a few steps to go, buy something somewhere. Anyway, Katherine, you've come from retail, but I also sense that you really haven't left retail. You've gone into another form of retail. I'd love to hear your personal journey and what you drew from the real intensive retail years, and what you've applied now to Stanley Black Decker.
Yeah, sure. So, in my career, similar to Steve, I got to witness the dramatic change in the landscape, firsthand. What Steve was saying about like shopping malls, and not just that, but traditional advertising. If you read his book, which you should go out and buy, the merchant prince era, like everything's driven by product, to like flash forward to today, like brands are not in control. We know that. There's what is traditional media anymore? There's like social, there's like endless aisles. There's these unbelievable expectations with, the Amazon effect, and like everything is like you're, driven from this device in my hand. And so I think at Stanley Black and Decker, just like every other company, it just means a complete like evolution of our entire operating model.
Yeah. Yeah, there's so many ways to have access, right? Just it's profound to me. Anyway, I'll hand it back to Kelly because I know she's got another question.
Yeah, I do. This is fascinating. I want to shift a little bit and talk about the how do we marry physical retail with digital online presence, and then we can take it a step further and talk about digital transformation and what that means. I think we've already transformed, and we're not going backwards. But I'd love to start with, again, a definition from both of you. Digital transformation, what does that mean to you? And then how have you applied that or seen that applied through organizations and brands, certainly pre-pandemic, and now the shifts that have happened digitally coming out of or in the midst of this pandemic? Steve, let's start with you. Your definition of the transformation that's happened in the digital space, and then shifts and pivots that have happened.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
Well, sometimes I feel, digital transformation is a bit of a buzz phrase. The digital revolution has been upon us for a really long time at this point. It just keeps getting either cheaper to apply digital technology or new applications get applied. But I think, since really the late 1990s, you had the ability for consumers to go online and see products digitally. You didn't have as much digital technology behind the scenes,
right?
Powering different things. It's just been a progression. I think, in terms of how it's changed retail, it's brought us all closer together. The things we were talking about in terms of convenience. Why go to a mall for products that you can get on your smart device and get delivered to your home? I mean, the consumer facing aspect's pretty obvious. The ability to get access to a tremendous amount of information, like that from all over the world. I mean, that's a radical transformation in terms of retail. The ability to be connected to people, whether it's your friends to share outfit advice, or whether it's to buy that thing from somebody on the other side of the world that they've made in their home, or whatever it might be. I mean, digital has just reshaped just about every part of what we do. So, it's hard to put my finger on one thing, or even say what digital transformation is. It's like, how did electricity change the world? It's like, wow, how much time do you have?
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, it's very
That's
true.
a good comparison. Electricity and digital transformation, similar kind of dramatic change.
Very true. Thank you, Steve. That's great perspective. Catherine, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I think digital transformation, I think we think of it as being the technology, but for us, a lot of it is the people and the culture. I'm sure you can appreciate a 200-year-old industrial manufacturer, and with these kind of go-to-market models being blurred, as I mentioned, like a dropship as an example, that involves everything from how you fulfill orders, which are like now single units versus pallets, to Salesforce incentives, and it just doesn't fit the sort of traditional ways of organizing and working together. And so while we were speaking to the consumer shifts internally, how work is delivered, and we're just not set up to like coalesce and disband around problems. It's just an entirely different way of achieving outcomes. So for us, digital transformation has a huge cultural and organizational angle to it.
Absolutely. From supply chain to just general operations, it has an impact across the board. Yes, Catherine, thank you for sharing.
Yeah, that was great.
Hybrid.
Kelly, thank you for bringing up supply chain, because we have to kind of talk about supply chain at some point in time, right? I mean, if we're talking retail, we cannot avoid that part of the conversation. All these people would wonder, why are they even doing this if they're not talking about this really hot topic of supply chain? So I'm curious, and Catherine, if you want to start this one off, what your perspective is on what we're going through and what the other side of it looks like as far as the change in supply chain, and is this going to have a dramatic kind of long-term positive effect on the supply chain, in that it may be a little less fragile after going through this in some way? What is your perspective currently on the supply chain? It's kind of a hot topic.
No, it is very, very top of mind for us, as you can imagine. So while I don't have a crystal ball, I can share that, if you think about our business, we were one of the biggest, beneficiaries to some extent of COVID. We had a huge surge as the home took on a new meaning, right, during the pandemic. But at the same time, we saw this global supply chain crisis. We saw inflation at levels that, we haven't seen in decades. On top of that, this isn't a macro issue, but we all had to adjust to remote work, like a lot of like shocks to the ways of doing business. So my perspective personally, while I can't speak to how long our ability to produce, ship, fulfill, will last, I do think that in a permanently volatile world, which I do believe we are in a new era of like VUCA, volatile, uncertain, ambiguous future, that I think we have to kind of scrap everything that we've learned, and the job description is just do what it takes. And we all are to some extent change leaders, so it's a very different like skill set and a very different mindset going forward. But I think supply chain is a good example of how we just have to pivot to this just unpredictability and shocks that are so unprecedented.
Yeah. It's definitely the word of the decade, unprecedented. Yeah. It's been, Stephen, what do you think about the supply chain as it relates to retail?
Well, I think first of all, I agree with Catherine that there has to be kind of this new agility built into just about everything we do, supply chain being part of that. One of the things I think is interesting we started to touch on is just, for a while, probably really until, I don't know, 10 years ago, you had kind of one supply chain for the stores. And, that was meant to get product from warehouses or manufacturers, whatever, into the store to go on shelves for customers to take home. You had another supply chain, which was really geared initially for mail order catalog, but then e-commerce, which was about pick, pack, and ship and delivering to a customer's home or maybe their office. Now you've also got this blurring and this hybridization of the supply chain. And, this is a little bit different issue than some of the disruptions we've seen in the supply chain this year because, product couldn't be shipped or you didn't have trucks or whatever. It's actually this reconfiguration of the supply chain because stores are playing a greater role in fulfillment. Consumers are demanding more and more same day, next day delivery, which can't be done out of some of these facilities. So I think we're not only dealing with the hopefully short-term issues of COVID and some of the just holes, I guess, in the supply chain that have become really pronounced. But I think we're really going to see a pretty significant reconfiguration of the supply chain and frankly of consumer-facing stores as well.
Yeah. Do you think it'll be sturdy, a little stronger, a little more able to handle this coming through this? We'd hope, at least, in some way.
I would hope so. What I don't have a good feel for, maybe Catherine does, is I think some of the things that need to happen to really reconfigure both the consumer-facing part of retail as well as all the things behind the scenes, they're not trivial investments. And there's a lot of factors, retail, maybe touch on this a little bit later. Or we touched on this a little bit earlier, but one of the things that I observed at Sears and even at Neiman Marcus to a certain degree is there's a tendency to protect the assets you have, right? You've got this big store, you've got this big distribution center, it's hard to say, maybe we should blow that up and do something completely new. And now some of that is not appreciating sunk costs, but some of the level of investment and change and time you have to put into it to really get yourself to a better state. Most companies have a hard time pulling the trigger on that. So my guess is that for it to be much more sturdy and really be responsive to what retail looks like in 5 or 10 years, it's going to take a lot of investment and a lot of creativity and I'm sure a lot of technology.
Yeah, and I agree with you, Steve, that it's not trivial, and it's the classic innovator's dilemma, right? Like you're trying, it's so volatile, you gotta comp. You're focused on the short term and protecting the base business, and so how do you even have the mind share, let alone the investment appetite, to really have a life raft for the future. So I think there will be some unfortunate casualties, and as this recalibration happens.
Yeah, legacy can be a very large gorilla sitting on your shoulders, for sure. Legacy investments, legacy everything, right? It's tough.
For
in
sure.
a lot of categories. Yes. Fascinating. Great answers. Thank you.
I know. And I'd like to go back to it. I know we've addressed this and we've alluded to it to a degree when we talk about the uniting, again, in retail, uniting the physical and the digital space, but struggling with how much of a store, for example, brick and mortar, is allocated to convenience and experience, that conflict between category merchandising and, curating memorable experiences. I'm curious if you could both add a little perspective on any advice you'd give to CEOs or commerce leaders for their organization to adapt and change what we see as conventional practices in retail. And just elaborate on that a little bit. Steve, you want to start with that one? And then Katherine, I'd love your thoughts.
Sure.
Okay.
Well, at the risk of being a little bit hyperbolic, I think a lot of retailers and a lot of CEOs, you almost have to start with a completely blank sheet of paper. I think there's too much of this incremental thinking that keeps a lot of retailers stuck. And certainly some of it is the silo, I think you're alluding to a little bit, the silos between physical and digital, and different metrics and all these kinds of things. I mean, that has absolutely been a problem for probably 2 decades now and still is a problem. But I almost think you have to just really say, okay, and this sounds like a cliche, but start with the customer segments we're trying to win, grow, and keep, and share our story. Understand what it's going to take to be successful today and to the best you can in the future. And how do we have to, I'm going to keep using this word, reconfigure. How do we have to reconfigure our business and our metrics, and in many cases our organizations, to be successful? And as long as I think you're holding on to the traditional metrics and the traditional organization, you're likely to experience what Katherine talked about, which is the innovator's dilemma. You'll never be bold enough to really change what you need to. And some of that is certainly entrenched cultures, but I think it's more than that. I think it's, we're going, I think, from an era where, we're very brand centric and format centric and channel centric to one where brands are really platforms, and there's a lot of different ways to bundle and rebundle what you do or bring in partners to go to market. And I think most retailers still are kind of on this, faster horse, as the quotation, building a faster horse, as opposed to saying, wait a minute, maybe instead of 10 stores that are all basically the same, maybe we need 2 that are real destinations, and then we need 20 that are service centers and pickup points, or dark store or something. So I think there's really this creative destruction process that needs to go on for a lot of retailers, at least the ones that are struggling to keep pace.
That's great. Yep. Marriage of strategy and creativity and big picture. Thanks, Steve. That's a wonderful thought. Katherine.
Yeah, so I chuckled when I read the anecdote, Steve, that you tell people on a plane, like, they're like, what do you do for a living? And you say omni-channel strategy, and they like look at you with a blank stare. But to me, that really captured that, sort of the mindset of, of the consumer. They don't care how you're organized. They don't care that, like they just need it. They need it fast. They need, like the expectations are just getting, to be you know, very, very hard for retailers to deliver against. So I think your question was about, you know, what advice would you give? So it's kind of along the lines of what I'm saying is that, what I said before, just that there is no playbook,
Right.
and even the fundamental question of like what business are we in is it needs to be flipped to like what does the consumer want, which doesn't fit the traditional sort of definition of functions or even like industries, as we said. But I think it's a brave new world, and it's been shown that companies that act swiftly after a crisis, you know, sort of reap the benefits. So I think that the incrementalism that Steve talked about has to be replaced with some, you know, just kind of rethinking and some you know risk taking, and the reconfiguration is not a trivial task.
Right. Sweeping changes. These are the best way. Thank you. That's
Yeah. You've both got tremendous history in different types of cultures, and Steve, you spoke about the similarities in the, you know, coming from Sears to Neiman Marcus, but yet the differences. And I'm curious about culture now and what you're seeing inside of your organizations. And maybe Katherine, you can start with this one. What is it? How are you managing the culture? How are you advancing the culture? And perhaps even, you know, what does the word curiosity play in that? Is that, you know, as it relates to innovation and new ideas? Do you want to take that one? The culture
Yeah,
conversation.
sure. The culture. So I think culture is we've all heard, you know, the line like culture eats strategy for breakfast, and I really do believe that it's a great ideas, and the most sophisticated strategies are nothing without the execution and the ability to work as a team. And so I think, you know, that the Stanley Black and Decker culture has always been kind of hard charging, want to win. But then there's also like the subculture of, you know, of sort of growth areas, and you can appreciate, you know, that the importance of speed, you know, and it's just the antithesis of a manufacturer with, you know, long lead times, like authority and certainty in terms of, you know, hierarchy, squeezing efficiency out of repeatable tasks. So it doesn't, you know, fit, and it requires a cultural evolution. So we've spent a lot of time, it was a massive, you know, change management exercise, but just getting our head around like what it means to be sort of a flat iterative, you know, risk taking. We branded it EWOW, you know, ways of working. And I do think that the future of how we work together, these teams that coalesce and disband around like business problems versus, you know, sort of again the functional silos that were sort of more discrete in the past. But I think, you know, it's the shift to remote work. You know, my team, I'm in 17 states and 2 Canadian provinces, like sort of new muscle. How do you build that culture, that agility in an entirely new, you know, sort of hybrid environment? So, but I think culture it's not sort of lip service. It's something that's absolutely critical to any kind of transformation.
yeah,
Absolutely.
Yeah, I really think perhaps the risk of stating the obvious. I think the cultural piece is the hardest thing to get right. I think I largely glossed over it in my book because I don't know that I had anything either that hadn't been said before or anything really new to say on it. I mean, I think somehow or other you have to get organizations to see risk in a fundamentally different way. When I go back to Sears, when I go back to Neiman Marcus, some of the clients I worked for, you know, I didn't come up with this term, but you know, the perception of risk was that it was risky for us to try new things, when in fact the most risky thing was for us not to try new things. You know, we kept waiting for the right moment or a miracle to happen or something where we were progressively getting, I mean, to varying degrees. I mean, Sears is certainly a different story than Neiman Marcus, but we were really that frog boiling in the water, right? Where we kind of knew things were getting worse, but it was happening so slowly to a point that there was a point of no return, basically. And so to try to build in, I mean, certainly think it's the type of people you hire. It's having an R&D budget, things that are going to have a low success rate, but you're going to do them anyway. It's celebrating failure. Amazon is probably the best company of any size in terms of how they built this into culture. But it's really tough, because for the most part, one of the things I learned at Neiman Marcus was, and Neiman Marcus is a great company, but there was a lot of defending of the status quo, and there was a lot of pride, deservedly so, around all the success. But the world was changing, and even though the data showed the world was changing, what it took to really respond to that was very different. And frankly, the sort of people that go to work at a company like Neiman Marcus, at least back then, aren't trying to revolutionize the world of retail. I mean, you don't attract necessarily. It's hard to attract those sort of people and get them into culture. I think there's plenty of examples, mine included, where basically been from the organization because they're like, we got to change faster, and we're like, okay, this is the department of no. You want the department of yes. That's a different place. So I think it really is a difficult issue, and I wish I had some more prescriptive ideas about it.
It's ever evolving. I think it's hard. You're right, Steve. I mean, it's hard to say this is the way it should be done as it continues to evolve over time.
Yeah. The real risk thing is a good perspective on it, though. I mean, really understanding risk is it's a fascinating cognitive bias we have as human beings, right? We can't see the real risk. It's right there in front of us, and that's why when you're on the outside looking at Sears from the outside looking at it, going, I can't believe they can't see this. How come they can't? But they can, just changing
it's the action.
one
of the things I stole from psychology, I forget who came up with this, is this idea of you have to have awareness, acceptance, and action. And a lot of organizations, from my experience, they can be pretty aware because they're doing all the studies. Many of them start to lose traction, I guess, in terms of accepting the reality of what this all means. But certainly the place where you really get into trouble is not enough action. And I like that Amazon, for example, keeps track of how many failed experiments they did in a given year. I've been in cultures where, you get one chance to do something and it would be a 3-year project, and if it didn't work out, it's like, oh, well, now we're 3 years behind, So, so I think there's a lot of good ideas out there, but it's hard in entrenched cultures to really make that change happen.
Yeah.
Right. I want to stay with this in the same vein. It's a similar vein as culture, inter-organizational. But when we talk about, I'd love both of your thoughts in historical roles that you've had in present day. When you think about those characteristics, because we've heard about the Great Resignation and how do we retain and recruit talent, I'm curious if you have thoughts you'd be willing to share in your personal opinion. The type of key characteristics, including hard and soft skills, that you'd say are critical for employers today. We've talked about innovative mindset. We've talked about curiosity. Any other thoughts you have around skills that are pretty much a must-have these days? Katherine, you want to take that one first?
Yeah, sure. So I think that with, just the world being so complex and interconnected and increasingly so, it's not any longer just about those hard skills.
Right.
And in many cases, those skills aren't, relevant in the new paradigm or have been commoditized, to some extent.
Mm-hmm.
So it's more about, connecting the dots and, having that mindset to be able to leave your comfort zone and have more range, I guess, in your skill set.
Mm-hmm.
And, if you do believe that the world is just moving toward more and more unpredictability and that the pace is just going to accelerate beyond what we can even get our heads around, then that kind of learning, that adaptability, you said curiosity, and also the soft skills, to be able to work across a lot of different, areas, I think are paramount.
That's great. Soft skills are key. Absolutely. Thank you, Katherine. Steve, Your thoughts?
I would agree with that. I mean, I sometimes get asked what allows, not to make this just about me, but sometimes I do that. But what allows me to do what I do, and I do think the range of experiences I've had. I've worked
Mm-hmm.
in all sorts of different price points, just about every retail category, off-price, e-commerce, and more tech jobs. And I think it is that ability to put pieces together that's become more and more important, make those connections.
Mm-hmm.
So I really agree with everything Katherine said. The one word I would add to it is vulnerability. I think that it's so important to be able to, and I don't want to say, show up as your authentic self or whatever, but it's really more about saying, I don't know, I need help. Like that, like if I have to do one thing over in my life or my life, but certainly in my career, willingness to say, what, I don't know what I'm doing here. I need some help, or
Mm-hmm.
this is going to fail. That's kind of, and I think if we were really just much more honest with each other, I think that's part of what allows people to take risk, because as a group and as an individual, you have that willingness to fail. And if you're so busy making yourself look good, or for this sort of imposter syndrome or whatever you want to call it,
Mm-hmm.
it's very, very difficult to take meaningful risks as an individual, but more importantly, in most companies, as a team.
Right.
Yeah.
We need more vulnerable leaders, honestly, to create that safe place for employees to feel as though it is okay to fail and take risks. No, that's great. Thank
Right.
you. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Yeah, that's wow. That's a really good one. The next subject is design, which we have to cover at some point in time in some way. And we both have a strong connection. And not that we don't want to, because we do love it as a subject area. And there's a lot to talk about in that space. And you both have not only design in your background in the sense that you've been in and around design, but also, I mean, you're currently in the world of it. Certainly, Katherine, product design, experience design, and all kinds of things related. So, I'm curious about each of your perspectives. So I want to start with Steve, because you have you actually mentioned design thinking and talk about design thinking as a way to look at the world. I'd love our audience to hear your perspective on that.
Well, thank you, but I am far from an expert on design thinking. But what I've found really interesting about it, at least, and I'm probably going to bastardize many of the definitions of it, is trying to put yourself in the shoes of the end customer, and come at it, I think, from more of an empathetic point of view rather than simply features and benefits. What is that end state the customer is trying to achieve? Which, sometimes, Katherine and I both worked in luxury. Like, you don't buy a $2,000 handbag because of the benefits of the handbag, right? You buy it for a bunch of other emotional states you're trying to help the customer, or you're trying to achieve in the company, the brand. So I just love that coming at it more from the kind of higher state, the story that about ourselves or share with. There's design thinking that's applied, more towards efficiency and really dissecting it. But and I think that's one of the important forks in the road, is whether we're really designing for more kind of an emotional need state, or we're designing basically to get something off our to-do list. So it's probably overly black and white, but I just love it. And to me, it's a different. Everybody says customer centric, and I find a lot of times that's just reduced to kind of a customer satisfaction survey or a simple gap analysis. What I like about design thinking is really coming at it in a broader perspective and working backwards.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah, that's a nice connection, especially the overuse of customer centric and what actually design thinking does, which is more empathy and finding that place to gather empathy around who you're designing this for, or what you're designing this for, right? Whatever it happens to be. Katherine, do you have some perspective on that, on design as a broader subject area and its importance?
Yeah, I personally thought about, in the next phase of the world, are the companies that are more like marketing led, like the big CPGs, or the design led companies like the phone, I don't know, more technology companies. Like, what is the right, sort of, we know where the power resides within certain organizations. And I've landed that I think they're both, complementary, but I do think that design is really important when the barriers to entry, as we know, are like so low. And you're earning your business every day, because online it's just created so many entrants, so much selection. Like, what is a brand? What is loyalty? Like there's a lot of choice, I guess. And so I guess, the way I think about it is, along the lines of what Steve was saying about the empathy, the looking at the pain points, what's the problem to be solved, and really, it could be as simple as like where buttons placed on a tool, but really solving a need versus just quantity over quality in terms of what you're thinking is design innovation.
Yeah. That's definitely elegant. There's it's an ongoing challenge for understanding it, and then being able to define what is good design, right? Is it an aesthetic conversation, or is it, it solves a specific problem, and it might not be aesthetically pleasing at all. It's just a really good solution to the problem. That's, I think, something
I always say it's both. So I drive the teams crazy when they're like, "Do you want it to work, or do you want it to be pretty?" And I said, "Both." I want it both. I want it beautiful, absolutely impeccable. There's no such thing as external and internal. Anything expectation. I have a big B2B component in my world. There is no lines now between like expectations. I'm a millennial purchaser. I want the same thing, same experience that I have in my personal life, and I want it to function, but I also want, so that makes it even more challenging, because it's
right.
Aesthetics is I think very, very key to the problems we're trying to solve, if that makes sense. It's not superfluous. It's not a trivial piece. It's very important to that experience.
Yeah, that's like something. That sounds like something Steve Jobs would say, right? I mean, it's like, no, I'm not giving up functionality for aesthetics, or aesthetics for functionality. No, it can't happen. That's great. Yeah. It is. It's an everyday challenge. Anyway, I'll hand it back over to Kelly.
Yeah, no, I just love, Steve, that you brought it. So when we talk about empathic marketing, I think we've heard it. I mean, I know I've heard in conversation, empathy in marketing isn't just a feel-good technique. It really does allow marketers and brand leaders to step into the shoes of their target audiences and better understand them, which I think is key to success in business. It's just interesting, the different lenses it can be applied. But glad we talked about that. That's certainly a critical part of understanding the consumer. I'm just going to ask a broad general question about some brands that you admire in the world these days, what they're doing right, what is it that they're doing correctly, and as a sort of a beacon of hope for the direction we're headed in marketing and otherwise. Who wants to take that one first?
I can.
Well,
I can hop in.
Go ahead, Catherine.
So, I personally, this is me as an individual, love, companies that is just kind of authentic to their purpose. So it's not a repeatable model. So like REI for, promoting time outdoors, or, Home Depot and Lowe's, that have their sustainability, but it's tied into their core operating model. And I really do think that's the new expectation, is this shareholder capitalism, or whatever we're calling it. I can speak from our experience at SBD, like we, it's not just on the ESG or D&I or what have you, like it's embedded in, we're developing sustainable power tools, and, it's not just like lip service. We're extending to, our makers communities that we, tradesmen and vocational training. And so it's really this integrated effort. But for me, the ones I find most meaningful is when it's not a, check the box because we've got to do it. It's actually kind of embedded into their core business.
Absolutely. Right. It's an overused word, but the authenticity that comes with that, and being transparent about the practices that happen behind the scenes and bringing that forward. Yes. So thank you, Catherine. That's great. Steve, what to add to that?
I'd probably, there certainly are some brands like REI, Patagonia, that I really, do feel like they live their values out very, very clearly, which I think is terrific. Two others I'd mention. I'm really, and I'm a little bit biased because they're a former client, but how Nike has been transforming their business from being, basically a wholesale only company to much more aggressive in consumer direct. But it's not just that. I think it's that they've been thinking, to get back to this kind of reconfiguration idea, they've been thinking about all the different types of formats or business models, whatever you want to call them, to elevate the brand and to maximize their sales and profits, presumably. Pulling on a lot of different levers. So their ability to mix different things together and certainly lean into digital for sure, but it's not like brick and mortar isn't incredibly important to what they're doing. This isn't the only one, but I think a brand like Warby Parker is also really, and I'm not wearing my Warby Parker glasses today, but what I think what Warby Parker has done is, they've really understood particular business very well, re-engineered their go-to-market strategy. Digital and physical are inseparable. They built it like a lot of great old catalog companies do. They started online, and then they have the physical stores really be complementary, but it's very easy for consumers to go back and forth between the channels, between the touch points, and have it all hang together very well. So it's a comparatively simple business model in one way of looking at it, but really, really elegant, I think, in terms of how they've executed it.
That's right. It's been seamless in execution. Absolutely. Thank you both.
Yeah, that's great. I am, if you don't mind me, Kelly, taking your finishing question, which
Please.
is the book or books that you're reading. I can tell that Catherine's very well read by the things that she's mentioned and talked about in this conversation has been dropped in, and of course, Steve, an author. We always like to get authors' perspectives on books to read because I find that they usually are hearing about the best ones to have on our reading list. So I'll start with you, Katherine. Do you have any recommendations on books other than the most obvious one, which is right here, which we've already recommended a couple of times and should again?
I
But
actually
any
really
other?
loved it. One that I think is interesting is Amp It Up or Amp It Up by the Snowflake founder.
Yeah.
You can't necessarily translate Silicon Valley to a Fortune 250, highly matrix organization, but I think some of the ideas are very interesting. Like the leader sets the tempo for the team, just building high performance cultures, the idea of speed. He just has a lot of very provocative thoughts on sort of next gen leadership.
I like that.
Nice.
To read that one. That's a
Excellent.
Right. Thank you.
Great. Steve?
Well, I'm a little embarrassed to say I haven't been reading that many books past year. I've been reading more. Well, I've been listening to more podcasts. I've been reading more short form stuff. I like Rashad Tabakawala's weekly newsletter, the name of which I'm going to forget. Scott Galloway's stuff I think is terrific. I have gone back to a couple of books recently. Seth Godin's most recent book, The Practice, which is really more about establishing habits to produce creative work. Seth and I have been friends for a long time, so I'm a little biased there. And in the going back to vulnerability, I love just about everything Brene Brown has written, and I find her work to be very inspirational. Not businessy directly, certainly not retail directly, but I find it very inspiring.
Yeah, and just to chime in on Rashad Tabakalawa, I love everything that comes out of that man's mouth. It's very interesting. It's about, marrying numbers and analytics with like being humans and, and empathetic leadership and like what the young people want. And it's if you have time to just Google him and read some of his writings, maybe not the book, but I just think it's simple but very profound.
Love that.
Oh, yes. These are good recommendations.
That's really good. Wonderful. Any other questions, Kelly, or we are almost at our hour?
We're coming to the top of the last question, and again, another broad question, but I think it's helpful for our listeners to hear, again, perspectives coming from different thought leaders across industries. On the horizon, what are you most looking forward to in 2022, either personally, professionally? Certainly we've seen consumer behaviors changing, but what impact is that having on you as an individual? And what are you looking forward to in this next year? Steve, I'll start with you.
Well, I love to travel, and I have been doing some. In fact, I'm going to Saudi Arabia on Saturday, so I have been doing
Wow.
some travel. But just for it to be more relaxed, just connecting with people in ways where we don't, have to be masked necessarily, or where just to be relaxed in connection with other people, whether that's in town or the other end of the world. I mean, I hope we'll get closer to that pretty soon. But I've gotten out of the predictions business, at least as far as things related to COVID.
You're not a betting man. I get it. Get it. Yes, we have an innate need to connect. It's time. It's time. Thank you. That's optimism there, Katherine.
So, I live in the middle of New York City, and like I've thought a lot about what are cities anymore, and the future of cities. And on the personal front, it's hard to say this because we know that the challenges of COVID have not been spread equally. The haves and the have-nots, but it has been personally challenging. It's all relative, not in the grand scheme of some of our frontline workers and some of the wealth gap disparities and such. But I can't wait to go to a time where I can have less volatility in my personal life with my children, and be able to have a semblance of not a crisis after a crisis after a crisis with school, and then really enjoy being in the center of such an amazing place as Manhattan, and really be able to sort of get back to some of the normalcy, if that's possible, that was pre-pandemic.
That's great.
Yeah.
We're headed in that direction. I think we are.
Right.
I'll believe
Yeah.
that's the case. Thank you both for sharing those thoughts. And we were so excited to have you today, and you didn't disappoint. We knew this would be a great conversation, and it absolutely was. So again, thank you both for joining. And thank you to our audience for joining. Aaron, any closing words?
No, I think this was great. Thank you both. This is wonderful, and I look forward to seeing everyone next month for our next two guests. And thank you again, Steve and Katherine. Phenomenal. I love Katherine. You made this happen, so thank you for doing this. Steve, you made this. You were the one that put him on the top of your list of who you'd like to be paired with. So I love that you did that, and it worked out really well.
Very kind.
Thank you, and good to see you both. I look forward to seeing you in person someday. As we all travel around and meet up. So
absolutely.
Thank you all.
Thanks, Steve.
And thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye-bye.